State Highway 19. Sunday night. A woman is driving through a storm, gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turn white. My name is Irene Ford, and I am fleeing the house that was supposed to be my sanctuary. An hour ago, my parents sat me down at their mahogany table, smiled over roast beef, and told me my life was a bad investment. They handed my future to my sister in a creamy white envelope and thought I would simply disappear. They were wrong. They didn't know that while they were trying to erase me, I was holding the match that would burn their perfect reputation to the ground. Like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. We always appreciate the time you spent here with us. The rain was hammering against the windshield so hard I could barely see the hood of my car, let alone the highway stretching out in front of me. My knuckles were white, gripping the steering wheel until my fingers ached, but I wasn't slowing down. I was driving away from the town I grew up in, the town that was supposed to be my home, with a feeling in my chest that was somewhere between heartbreak and pure cold rage. The last time I had sat at my parents' dinner table, just an hour before, they had looked me in the eye, sacrificed me in front of my whole family, and tried to erase me. I didn't know it then, driving through that storm, but my revenge wouldn't happen in a courtroom or a shouting match. It would end up on 500,000 phones played through earbuds in dark rooms and crowded subways across the country. But to explain how I went from the invisible daughter to the woman who burned the family image to the ground, I need to take you back to one specific Sunday night. I pulled into the driveway of my parents' house just as the sun was setting. It was the kind of house that screams respectable family. The lawn was manicured within an inch of its life. The American flag hung perfectly limp by the front porch, and my father's pristine SUV sat in the driveway looking like it had just rolled off the lot. This was the Ford residence. Inside, everything was sensible. That was my father's favorite word. Richard Ford, the local high school principal, didn't believe in luck. He believed in order, hierarchy, and sensibility. My mother, Elaine, was the perfect counterpart, a PTA legend and church volunteer who treated our family reputation like a delicate piece of china that needed constant polishing. I walked in, and the dynamic was already set in stone. My older sister, Laura, was holding court in the living room. Laura was the golden child, the one who followed the blueprint. She was a polished corporate success story working at a marketing firm in Dallas, and she was currently planning a wedding that rivaled a royal coronation. Then there was me, Irene, the freelance UX designer, the part-time barista, the one who was always just a little too artsy, a little too unstable for Richard and Elaine Ford. And beside me was Daniel. My parents tolerated Daniel, but just barely. He was quiet, mid-30s, and drove a beat-up truck that looked like an eyesore in their driveway. When they asked what he did, he just said he worked in media and tech, which to them meant he probably fixed computers or posted videos on the internet. He dressed simply, spoke rarely, and never talked about money. To the Fords, Daniel was a non-entity. They had no idea who he really was, and that ignorance was going to cost them everything. Dinner was a performance, as always. We sat around the mahogany table, the clinking of silverware filling the silence. As I picked at my roast beef, I couldn't help but feel the weight of a lifetime of Sunday dinners just like this one. Flashbacks hit me between bites. I remembered when Laura turned 16 and got a brand new car with a red bow, while I got Dad's rusted sedan with the broken heater 2 years later. I remembered when Laura's private college tuition was paid in full without a blink, while I was sent to community college and told to be grateful for the lesson in self-reliance. My art was a hobby. Laura's PowerPoints were leadership. The phrase echoed in my head something my father had said 1,000 times. In this family, Irene, we support winners. But tonight was supposed to be different. When Daniel and I got engaged, my parents had made a promise. They pledged $12,000 to my wedding fund. It was the exact same amount they had initially put aside for Laura. For the first time in my life, things were going to be equal. I wasn't asking for a luxury affair. I just wanted a backyard wedding without going into debt. That 12 grand was my safety net. The conversation lulled, and the air in the room grew heavy. That's when I noticed the envelope. It was sitting on the table near my father's right hand, thick and creamy white. Richard cleared his throat, putting on his principal voice, the tone he used when he was about to suspend a student or lecture the faculty. My stomach tightened. I suddenly felt 17 again, bracing for impact. I looked at Daniel, and he gave me a small, reassuring nod, but I could feel the temperature in the room dropping. Irene Daniel. My father started placing a hand on the envelope. Your mother and I have been doing some thinking about the upcoming nuptials. I smiled nervously, expecting him to slide the check over to me so we could finally put a deposit down on the caterer. But his hand didn't move toward me. He looked at Laura, who was studying her fingernails with a look I knew too well, a mix of feigned embarrassment and smug satisfaction. We had to make a sensible decision, my mother added, her voice tight and chirpy, about the resources. Richard picked up the envelope. He didn't slide it to me. He slid it across the table to Laura. We've decided to give the wedding fund to Laura, he said, his voice flat and final. She's planning a significant event, one that reflects well on all of us. She deserves a real wedding, the kind our family can be proud of. The silence that followed was deafening. I stared at the envelope sitting in front of my sister, then up at my parents' faces. They weren't looking at me with guilt. They were looking at me with expectation, waiting for me to nod and accept my place in the background. Under the table, Daniel's hand clamped down on my knee hard. The word family rang in my ears, but for the first time it didn't sound like a promise. It sounded like a threat. The world didn't stop, but it felt like the oxygen had been sucked right out of the room. I sat frozen, my hands trembling in my lap, unable to look away from that white envelope resting near my sister's manicured fingers. The silence in the dining room was suffocating, amplified by the tiny, hyper-real sounds of a domestic Sunday night. I could hear the ice shifting and cracking in my father's water glass. I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, counting down the seconds of my humiliation. Across the table, Laura offered a tight, sympathetic grimace, but her eyes didn't match the expression. There was a glimmer there, a smirk she was trying desperately to swallow. It felt like my parents hadn't just slid an envelope across the mahogany. It felt like they had just signed the papers to legally erase me from the family narrative. Now, Irene, don't look like that, my father said, slicing a piece of roast beef with surgical precision. We have to be practical. This isn't personal, it's economics. It's about stability, honey, my mother chimed in, leaning forward with that concerned, pitying look she usually reserved for sick relatives. Laura has a significant corporate position. She's a vice president now. And Aaron is a CPA. He comes from good people. The Blakes are very established in the county. Their wedding is going to be a networking event as much as a celebration. It reflects on all of us. Then she turned her gaze to me, and the pity curdled into judgment. You're still figuring things out, Irene. You're freelancing. The income is sporadic. You've had to ask us for help with rent twice in the last 3 years. You and Daniel just aren't stable yet. The words hit me like physical blows. Investment. Return. Winners. I realized with a sick, sinking feeling that they weren't looking at me as their child. They were looking at me as a bad stock portfolio. They were hedging their bets, pouring their resources into the daughter who could carry the family name and image forward while cutting their losses on the one who simply wanted to be happy. I had been taught my whole life that family supports you, but in that moment, I saw the truth. The Fords only supported the things that made the Fords look good. Laura reached out and touched the envelope, her diamond engagement ring catching the chandelier light. I didn't ask for this, Irene, she said, her voice dripping with a performative sweetness that made my teeth ache. But you have to admit my guest list is huge. We have clients coming in from Dallas, Aaron's partners. This is really about what's best for the family. We have to put our best foot forward. Underneath the apology was a pure, unfiltered gloat. She had won. Again. Beside me, Daniel was dead silent. He hadn't moved a muscle since the envelope slid across the table, but I could feel the tension radiating off him like heat. He was watching them, my father's arrogant chewing, my mother's nervous smoothing of the tablecloth, Laura's greedy grip on the money. He was taking it all in. My father wiped his mouth with a napkin and glanced at Daniel with a dismissive wave of his hand. Honestly, it just makes sense to keep the money where it will be managed properly. We're not even sure what Daniel does. Media could mean anything these days. For all we know, he's just posting TikToks in a basement somewhere. Daniel's jaw tightened. The muscles in his neck corded, but he didn't speak. I felt a sudden sharp spike of fear. They were dismantling my future, insulting the man I loved, and erasing my identity, all while eating pot roast. That isn't fair, I finally whispered, the sound scraping out of my throat. Then louder. That isn't fair. You promised. You said it would be equal. Life isn't equal, Irene, Richard said calmly. I missed my own college graduation because you made me go to Laura's award dinner. I snapped, the dam finally breaking. I drove a rusted death trap while she drove a brand new sedan. You have favored her every single day of my life, and now you're stealing my wedding to pay for hers. My father slammed his fork down. The sharp clang silenced the room. He looked at me with cold, hard eyes, the eyes of a principal dealing with a delinquent. We are not trying to hurt you, Irene, he said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal register. But we have a responsibility to this family's legacy. We simply cannot throw good money after bad choices. The air left my lungs. Bad choices. My art, my career, my life, my fiancé, all reduced to a bad investment they needed to write off. I sat there, stunned, tears stinging my eyes, waiting for the floor to open up and swallow me whole. That's when Daniel stood up. He didn't rush. He placed both hands flat on the table and pushed his chair back with a deliberate scrape against the hardwood. He looked tall, suddenly towering over my seated parents. The room went deadly quiet. There's something you should probably know about me, Daniel said, his voice terrifyingly calm, before you decide exactly how disposable your daughter is. The silence that followed Daniel's statement was heavy enough to crush bone. My parents blinked at him, their expressions caught somewhere between confusion and the reflex to scold a subordinate. But Daniel wasn't acting like a subordinate. He reached into the pocket of his worn denim jacket and pulled out his phone. He didn't slam it down. He simply unlocked it, tapped the screen a few times, and turned it around to face Richard and Elaine. You asked what I do in media, Daniel said, his voice level. I thought I should clarify. I looked at the screen. It wasn't a social media profile or a tech support page. It was a professional website, sleek and dark with high-contrast photography. The header read in bold white letters, "The Undercurrent with Daniel Ruiz." Underneath, there was a subheader, "Investigating Hidden Abuse in American Families, Workplaces, and Communities." There were press logos, NPR, the New York Times heavy hitters, and photos of Daniel looking nothing like the guy in the t-shirt standing next to me. In the photos, he was wearing tailored suits, sitting on panels, holding microphones with an intensity that commanded the room. I'm an investigative journalist and a documentarian. Daniel explained, his eyes never leaving my father's face. I host one of the top 5 relationship and true story podcasts in the country. My specialty is family systems, specifically financial exploitation, and the dynamics between golden children and scapegoats. My mother's fork clattered against her plate, the sound jarring in the quiet room. Richard's face, usually so composed and rigid, seemed to crack. The mask of the sensible principal slipped, revealing a flash of genuine panic. But it was Laura who reacted first. She stared at the phone, her eyes darting back and forth as she calculated the math. She worked in marketing. She knew exactly what top 5 podcast meant. She knew that meant reach. She knew that meant millions of people. Daniel wasn't done. He tapped the screen again, switching apps. A red waveform was scrolling across the display, pulsing with the ambient noise of the room. I started recording about 10 minutes ago, Daniel said. He said it casually, like he was commenting on the weather. Right around the time you started talking about investing in winners and referring to your daughter's life as a bad choice. You see, Richard, my career is built on stories exactly like this one. Stories where respectable people think they can erase one child to elevate another as long as they do it behind closed doors. My heart hammered against my ribs. A mix of shock and betrayal washed over me. He recorded them, but it was instantly overtaken by a strange, dizzying sense of relief. For 30 years, my reality had been denied. Every time I said things were unfair, I was told I was dramatic or imagining things. Now the waveform on that screen proved I wasn't crazy. It was proof. Irene, Daniel said softly, turning to me. Can we speak in the hall for a second? I nodded numbly. We stepped away from the table, leaving my family sitting in a frozen tableau of horror. In the hallway out of their earshot, the adrenaline finally hit me. My hands started to shake. You recorded them, I whispered. I suspected something was off, he said, his voice low and urgent. The way you talked about them, the way you shrank every time your phone rang. I wanted to be wrong, Irene. But when the conversation shifted to money, I knew I needed insurance. I'm not going to do anything with it unless you want me to. I can delete it right now. I looked at him, and then I looked back toward the dining room. The wedding fund wasn't just about a party. It was the principle. And suddenly, a darker realization clawed its way up from the back of my memory. It's not just the wedding money. I confessed, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. My grandparents, they started a college savings account for me when I was born. A big one. But when I turned 18, my parents told me the market had crashed, that the money was gone. They said tuition was more expensive than they thought. I looked at Daniel, my eyes widening as the pieces clicked into place. Laura went to a private university that year, fully paid. They didn't lose my money, Daniel. They gave it to her. They've been doing this my whole life. Daniel's expression darkened, a look of profound sorrow and anger crossing his face. Okay, he said. Then we have options. We walked back into the dining room. The atmosphere had shifted. My father was trying to regain control, puffing up his chest. This is ridiculous, Richard scoffed, though his voice wavered. Recording a private family dinner. It's illegal. It's internet drama. Nobody cares about your little radio show, son. It's not a radio show, Richard, Daniel said, standing behind my chair like a guard dog. And the 3 million people who listen to my episodes on narcissistic financial control might disagree with you. They tune in to hear about people like you, pillars of the community, who cannibalize their own children to keep up appearances. Daniel looked directly at me, then ignoring my parents, ignoring Laura, who was now pale and silent. Irene, he said clearly so everyone could hear, this is your story. You are the only one who gets to decide how it ends. If you ever decide you're ready to tell it, I will help you. On the record. I looked at my parents. They looked small. For the first time in my life, the fear wasn't radiating off me. It was radiating off them. That night, I walked out of that house with no wedding fund, no parents, and a shattered heart. But as I grabbed my purse and turned my back on them, I realized I was leaving with something far more dangerous. I was leaving with power. That night, I didn't sleep. I spent the hours between midnight and dawn sitting on the cold linoleum of my kitchen floor, staring at the humming refrigerator. The adrenaline from the dinner had worn off, leaving behind a hollow, aching crater in my chest. I kept replaying the scene in my mind, the envelope sliding across the table, the look of indifferent calculation in my father's eyes. It wasn't just the money. It was the confirmation of something I had suspected since I was a little girl, but was too afraid to name. I was the placeholder. Laura was the protagonist of the Ford family story, and I was just a background character they could edit out whenever the plot required it. The word sacrificed kept looping in my brain. They had sacrificed my stability for her luxury. They had sacrificed my dignity for their image. If I stay quiet, I whispered to the empty room, I am letting them write the rest of my life. It was a terrifying thought. In my small town, family loyalty was practically a religion. You didn't air dirty laundry. You smiled, you endured, and you protected the name on the mailbox. But I realized then that protecting their image came at the cost of my own freedom. Daniel found me there around 4:00 a.m. He sat down next to me, handing me a mug of tea. He didn't tell me what to do. He just looked at me with that steady, grounding presence and said, "Irene, you don't owe them your silence, but you also don't owe the internet your pain. This is entirely about what you want. If you want to burn it all down, I have the matches. If you want to walk away, we walk away." I took a breath, the first deep one I'd taken in hours. "I don't want to hurt them," I said, my voice raspy. "But I don't want to carry their secret anymore." 2 days later, we were in Daniel's home studio. It was a small, soundproofed room lined with foam, quiet as a tomb. I sat in front of the microphone, my hands shaking so hard I had to clasp them together in my lap. We decided to do it anonymously. We changed the names. My parents became the investors. Laura became the golden sister. My hometown became just a quiet suburb. When the red recording light flickered on, I froze for a second. Then I closed my eyes and let it all out. I told the story of the Sunday dinners. I told the story of the envelope. I described the feeling of being told I was a bad choice by the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. I spoke for 40 minutes, my voice cracking, but never breaking, ending with the sentence that had been haunting me. My parents tried to erase me to protect their perfect family story. We released the episode on a Tuesday. By Thursday, my world had tilted on its axis. The download numbers were staggering. Tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands. But it wasn't the numbers that floored me. It was the comments. People from all over the world were writing in, sharing their own stories of being the backup child, the scapegoat, the one sacrificed so the golden sibling could shine. I sat at my computer scrolling through them, tears streaming down my face. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel invisible. I felt seen by an army of strangers. But anonymity on the internet is fragile, especially when the details are specific. By the weekend, the whispers started in my hometown. The story was too familiar. The description of the pillar of the community father who loved the word sensible struck a chord. A teacher at the high school recognized the cadence of my father's voice in the background of the audio clip Daniel had included. The rumors spread through the grocery store, the church pews, and the neighborhood group chats like wildfire. My phone rang on Sunday night. It was my father. "How could you?" Richard didn't say hello. His voice was trembling with a rage I had never heard before. "You ungrateful, spiteful little—" He trailed off, choking on his own fury. "We gave you everything, Irene. A roof over your head, food on your table. And this is how you repay us, by humiliating us, by betraying your own blood." "I didn't betray you," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "I just told the truth. If the truth humiliates you, that's not my fault." "You are cutting yourself out of this family," my mother shouted from the background. "Don't expect a penny. Don't expect to be in the will. We sacrificed for you." They were still using that word. Sacrificed. As if their neglect was a noble burden they had carried. I hung up on them. My hands were trembling again, but this time it wasn't from fear. It was from clarity. I realized they were terrified. They weren't mad because I lied. They were mad because I had taken away their control. "Irene," Daniel said from the doorway. He was holding his laptop, his face pale. "Someone in the comments mentioned something. They said if your parents were willing to steal your wedding fund, you should check everything else." "What do you mean?" "I mean we need to pull your credit report. Right now." I didn't want to look. I wanted it to be over. But I sat down and entered my social security number. The report loaded a spinning wheel of doom. When the list of accounts popped up, I scanned past my student loans and my small car payment, and then I stopped. There at the bottom of the list was a personal loan for $20,000 and a credit card with a $15,000 limit. Both had been opened 7 years ago when I was 19. Both listed a mailing address that wasn't my college apartment. It was my parents' house. I felt the blood drain from my face. That's when I realized the wedding fund wasn't the biggest thing they'd stolen from me. They hadn't just erased my present. They had mortgaged my future. The days following the discovery of the credit report were a blur of forensic accounting and nausea. Daniel and I turned his studio into a war room, covering the walls with printed bank statements, old emails, and timelines. We dug until our fingers were stained with ink, and my heart was stained with a permanent shade of cynicism. We tracked down a bank manager, an old friend of my father's, who hesitantly admitted over the phone that Richard had handled the paperwork for me years ago to simplify things. With that loose thread, the whole sweater unraveled. The truth was worse than I had imagined. The college fund my grandparents left me hadn't vanished in a market crash. It had been liquidated and consolidated into Laura's account 3 weeks before her tuition was due at her private university. But the knife twisted deeper. The mysterious $20,000 loan and the credit card in my name. They dated back to the summer. Laura took an unpaid internship in New York City. My credit score had been torched to pay for my sister's sublet in Manhattan, and judging by the dates on the hardware store charges, the renovation of my parents' back deck. It was a literal legal sacrifice. They had cannibalized my financial future to feed the golden child's success. I sat staring at the stack of evidence, a physical brick of betrayal. If I take this to them, I said, my voice trembling, I could ruin them. This is fraud, Daniel. If this gets out, Dad loses his license, Mom loses her standing, it destroys the family. I felt that old conditioned guilt rising up, the programming that told me my job was to protect the Fords, even if the Fords were eating me alive. Daniel placed a hand on the stack of papers. You aren't ruining the family, Irene. You're just turning on the lights. They're the ones who smashed the furniture. Resilience isn't about enduring abuse. It's about standing up when the people you love are the ones holding the knife. I called my father an hour later. I told him we needed to meet. He tried to regain the upper hand immediately. Fine, he snapped. But you come alone. No Daniel. No recording devices. We handle this internally. I didn't answer. I just hung up. When I walked through the front door of my childhood home the next evening, Daniel was right beside me. My father stood in the foyer, his face turning a mottled shade of red, but I walked past him before he could speak. I went straight to the dining room, the scene of the crime, and dropped the heavy binder of documents onto the mahogany table with a loud thud. My mother and Laura were already there, looking like they were attending a funeral. I didn't sit down. I opened the binder and began spreading the papers out, covering the placemats with bar graphs and highlighted bank transfers. What is this? Laura asked, her voice thin. This, I said, pointing to a highlighted row, is the loan taken out in my name that paid for your apartment in Chelsea. And this is the credit card debt that paid for the deck Dad is so proud of. And this is the transfer slip moving my college fund into your tuition account. I looked up at them. This is the ledger. This is exactly what I cost. Richard tried to laugh, a nervous barking sound. You're confused, Irene. Those were bridge loans. We intended to pay them back. It was a family decision to leverage our assets. I am not an asset, I screamed, the sound tearing from my throat. I am your daughter. You stole my identity to fund her internship. Elaine stood up, her face twisting not with shame but with frustration. We did what we had to do. Laura had a shot, Irene. A real shot at a big life. You were painting and working at a coffee shop. We couldn't let her opportunities wither on the vine just because you were still finding yourself. We managed the resources for the person with the most potential. The room went dead silent. There it was, the naked truth. Potential. I repeated the word, tasting like ash. You didn't just sacrifice money. You sacrificed me. You looked at your 2 children and decided one was a person and the other was fuel. I took a deep breath, feeling a strange cold clarity settle over me. Here is what happens now. You are going to repay every cent with interest. You are going to apologize publicly, and you are going to treat me as an equal from this day forward. Or I walk and I take this binder to the police. I won't keep carrying the shame for what you did, I continued, my voice steadying. If you try to erase me again, I will survive it. But the truth is already out there and I have the receipts. Richard's face hardened into a mask of pure loathing. He stood up, shaking with rage, and pointed a trembling finger at the front door. He didn't look like a principal anymore. He looked like a cornered animal. "Get out," he hissed. "If you think you can blackmail your own flesh and blood, then you are no daughter of mine. Consider yourself erased." He waited for me to crumble, to beg for forgiveness. Instead, I closed the binder, picked it up, and turned to Daniel. "Let's go." I walked out into the cool evening air, my heart pounding, but my head high. I left that house with nothing from my parents, no money, no blessing, no safety net. But as I got into the car, I realized I had everything I needed to build my own family, and I finally knew exactly what I was worth. The weeks after I walked out of my parents' house were a strange mix of grief and liberation. We didn't hear a word from Richard or Elaine, no apology, no demand for the binder, just a stony, punitive silence. They were waiting for me to break. They were waiting for me to realize I couldn't survive without the Ford safety net. But they had underestimated what happens when you strip someone of everything. You also strip them of their fear. Daniel and I decided we weren't going to postpone our life just because my parents were throwing a tantrum. We were going to get married, but it wasn't going to be the pageant my mother would have planned. We scaled everything down to what we could afford on our own. There was no country club, no 12-piece band, and certainly no wedding fund. Instead, we found something better. The American spirit of community, the kind my father preached about in his speeches but never actually practiced, showed up on our doorstep. Daniel's extended Mexican-American family descended on us like a warm, chaotic whirlwind. His aunts took over the catering, filling our kitchen with the smell of mole and fresh tortillas. His cousins spent weekends stringing fairy lights and building tables. It wasn't perfect, it was real. Support came from places I never expected. A couple I had served coffee to every morning for 3 years, the Millers heard through the grapevine that we were looking for a venue. They offered us their small working farm just outside of town for free. And then there were the listeners. The podcast episode had touched a nerve so deep that strangers were emailing us offering to send handmade decorations or even money. I turned down the cash, asking them to donate to a charity for family abuse survivors instead. But the gesture stitched something back together in my heart. I realized I had traded 2 parents who saw me as an investment for 1,000 strangers who saw me as a human being. The day of the wedding was crisp and golden. As I put on my dress, a simple vintage piece I'd found at a thrift store, and altered myself, I felt a pang of profound sadness. A girl wants her dad to walk her down the aisle. A girl wants her mom to zip up her dress. But as I looked in the mirror, I saw the woman who had walked out of that dining room, and I knew she was strong enough to walk down the aisle alone. The ceremony was beautiful, held in the open air of the Miller's barn. When Daniel's father stood up to give a toast, he raised his glass and looked at us with teary eyes. "Blood makes you related," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But loyalty makes you family, and today you have chosen your family." The room erupted in cheers, a stark contrast to the polite, stifled applause at the Ford dinner table. But the peace didn't last. Midway through the reception, while the dance floor was heaving, one of Daniel's cousins tapped me on the shoulder. He looked uneasy. "Irene," he whispered. "There's a black SUV idling in the gravel lot near the entrance. I think it's your parents." My stomach dropped. Of course. They couldn't let me have this. They couldn't stand the idea of an event happening without their control, without their approval. They weren't there to apologize. They were there to scout, to see if the wedding was a disaster so they could feel superior, or to crash it and force a photo op so they could pretend everything was fine to the neighbors. "I'll handle it," I said, putting a hand on Daniel's chest before he could move. "Stay here." I walked out of the barn, the music fading behind me. The sun had set, and the headlights of my father's pristine SUV cut through the darkness. As I approached, the doors opened. Richard and Elaine stepped out. They were dressed up, my father in a suit, my mother in a cocktail dress, looking for all the world like guests who were simply late. "Irene," my father said, adjusting his tie. He used his principal voice, the one that expected immediate compliance. We decided to be the bigger people. We're willing to make an appearance. For the sake of the family image, we should probably take a few photos. My mother nodded, clutching her purse. People will talk if we aren't seen, Irene. We can just say there was a misunderstanding with the time. I stopped 10 feet away from them. I didn't yell, I didn't cry. I just looked at them. Really looked at them and saw two small, frightened people who cared more about what the town thought than about the daughter standing in front of them. You aren't welcome here, I said. My voice was low, but it didn't shake. Excuse me. My father bristled, stepping forward. This is my daughter's wedding. I have a right. You have no rights here, I interrupted. You forfeited those when you tried to erase me. You don't get to come in here and pretend you're good parents just so you don't look bad at church on Sunday. There are no photos today. There is no family image. There is just me and the people who actually love me. You are humiliating us, my mother hissed, looking around the empty parking lot as if checking for witnesses. No, I said, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders. You did that to yourselves. I took a step back, drawing a line in the gravel with the toe of my shoe. You taught me that a family can choose to erase someone whenever it suits them. Well, I learned the lesson. I'm choosing not to erase myself anymore. Go home. My father opened his mouth to argue, but something in my face stopped him. He saw the ledger. He saw the podcast. He saw the girl who wasn't afraid of him anymore. He sneered a mask of pure ugliness and got back into the driver's seat. My mother followed, slamming the door. I watched the taillights fade down the dirt road, leaving me in the dark. But it wasn't cold. I turned around and walked back toward the barn where the lights were warm and the music was loud. I thought that was the end of our story, the villains driving away the hero returning to the party. I was wrong. The car ride home was just the beginning of the fallout. 2 years later, the silence in my house is different. It isn't the heavy, suffocating silence of the Ford dining room waiting for the next criticism to drop. It's the peaceful silence of a Sunday morning in a home that Daniel and I built ourselves. We moved 3 states away, settling into a modest bungalow with squeaky floors and a backyard that's more weeds than lawn, but it's ours. My career looks different too. I stopped designing flashy marketing campaigns for corporations. Now I design digital experiences for mental health nonprofits and community organizations. I spend my days illustrating the stories of survivors, using my art to turn pain into a roadmap for someone else. The story I told on Daniel's podcast didn't just fade away into the digital ether. The original anonymous episode sparked a mini movement. We called it The Erased, and thousands of people wrote in sharing their own versions of being sacrificed for the family image. Eventually, I went back on the mic, this time using my real name. Taking ownership of the narrative was terrifying, but the response was overwhelming. I still get emails every week from listeners telling me that hearing my voice gave them the courage to leave abusive homes, to set boundaries, or to finally walk into a therapist's office. Back in my hometown, the Ford family legacy didn't survive the sunlight. We heard through the grapevine that the rumors about my father's financial maneuvering eventually made their way to the school board. Richard Ford is still a principal, but the pillar of the community facade has cracked. Parents started asking questions. A few even moved their kids to different districts. His authority, once absolute, is now shadowed by whispers. My mother fared no better. The church ladies who thrive on moral superiority slowly distance themselves. It turns out stealing your daughter's identity to renovate your deck isn't something you can easily pray away at the Wednesday potluck. But the most surprising shift came from Laura. For a long time, she didn't speak to me. She was angry that I had popped the bubble of her perfect life. But eventually, the reality of her success began to gnaw at her. She had to confront the fact that her self-made career was built on the foundation of my stolen college fund and my credit score. She reached out 6 months ago, asking to meet for coffee in a neutral city between us. When I walked in, she didn't look like the golden child. She looked tired. She admitted over a cold cup of latte that deep down she had known. She knew the money had to come from somewhere. She knew I was struggling while she was thriving. She apologized, not a performance for an audience, but a quiet, shameful admission between sisters. We aren't best friends. We don't braid each other's hair. But we have a truce built on honesty, which is worth more than a lifetime of fake smiles. Finally, the letter came. It was handwritten on my father's stationery. It wasn't a warm letter, but it was a surrendered one. After 2 years of public pressure and private isolation, Richard and Elaine finally broke. They asked to meet. I agreed, but I set the terms. We met in a therapist's office, a neutral ground where they couldn't control the environment. They didn't try to excuse their actions this time. They confessed. They admitted to liquidating my college fund. They admitted to opening the credit cards. They admitted that they had favored Laura because they viewed her as the better investment and tried to erase me to streamline the family narrative. I listened. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. When they finished, they looked at me expecting me to rush forward and hug them to grant them the absolution they were desperate for. Instead, I leaned back in my chair. I appreciate the truth, I said, but truth is just the baseline. If you want a relationship with me, here is what happens next. I laid out my conditions: weekly therapy for them individually and together, a strict legally binding financial restitution plan to pay back every cent they stole with interest, and absolutely no pretending that the past didn't happen, no sweeping it under the rug for the holidays. Forgiveness. I told them standing up to leave is something I do for myself, so I don't have to carry your poison anymore. But trust. Trust is something you have to earn, and you are starting from zero. I keep them at arm's length now. We talk occasionally. I might visit for a holiday if I feel up to it, but I always stay in a hotel. My emotional safety comes first. Looking back, I realize that my parents tried to define my life as a failed investment. They saw me as a disposable daughter, a background character to be edited out. But standing up to them, even when it meant losing the only family I had ever known, was the moment I actually became free. I found resilience I didn't know I had. I found a community of strangers who became my army. And I learned that personal freedom is the only wealth that actually matters. My parents thought they could erase me to protect our family name. Instead, I wrote my name on a story the whole world heard, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't invisible. And just like that, Irene proved that being erased is a choice, not a sentence. If this story of reclaiming one's life resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button to join our community. What would you have done if you found that ledger on the table? Let us know below. We read every single comment of your thoughts. Thank you for listening. This has been a story from Radiance. We'll see you next time.